The lights on the station dimmed the moment the council delegation entered the chamber, and I felt my hands go cold. My name is Ethan Cole, and I was standing at the back wall of the Grand Assembly Hall, holding a datapad I did not need, pretending to look busy so nobody would ask me to leave. I was the lowest-ranking person allowed in that room. I was only there because Ambassador Grace Whitfield trusted me to keep records, and because someone had to carry her water when her throat went dry from talking to creatures who did not breathe air the way we did. 6 alien species sat around the circular table that day. I had memorized their names months ago, but in that moment my mind went blank, because every single one of them was looking at us the way a judge looks at a prisoner already found guilty. The chief envoy of the council, a tall being named Threll, rose from his seat. His skin had a faint blue shine under the hall lights, and his voice came out low and slow, like he wanted every word to land with weight. "Delegates of Earth," he said, "the Council has reviewed your continued refusal to disarm your nuclear stockpiles, your orbital defense platforms, and your unregistered fleet vessels. You were given 3 warnings. You ignored all 3. Grace did not move. She sat with her hands folded on the table, calm as still water. Threll continued. Under Article 12 of the Unification Accords, the Council hereby declares a state of war against the human race, effective immediately. The room went silent. I remember hearing my own heartbeat. I had read about wars in history books. I had seen old pictures from Earth's past, grainy photographs of trenches and burning cities. I knew what the word war was supposed to mean. But sitting there, watching an alien elder announce it like a business decision, it did not feel real. It felt like a performance. Then Grace Whitfield leaned forward, just slightly, and asked a question that would end up printed on every human newsfeed within the hour. "Is that all?" Threll blinked. I do not know if his species could show confusion the way ours could, but something in his posture shifted, like a man who had rehearsed a speech and suddenly forgot his next line. "I am not certain you understand the gravity of what I have said," he replied. "I understand it perfectly," Grace said. "You are declaring war on 11 billion people because we would not hand over the ability to defend ourselves. I ask if that is all, because if it is, we have transportation to arrange, and I would like to know how much time you are giving us before the first ships arrive." A murmur passed through the other delegates. One of them, a smaller being with silver eyes named Counselor Yvonne, spoke up in a tone that sounded almost gentle, almost like she pitied us. "Ambassador, perhaps you misunderstand the scale of the unified fleet. We have crushed rebellions from species with technology far beyond your own. This is not a threat. It is a formality before the inevitable." Grace smiled. It was not a big smile, just a small curve at the corner of her mouth, but I saw it, and I understood something in that moment that I would spend the rest of my life trying to explain to people who were not in that room. She was not afraid. "I appreciate the warning," Grace said. "Truly, most people do not get a countdown before something tries to end them. I will pass along your declaration to my government. Is there anything else the Council requires from us today, or are we finished?" Threll stared at her for a long moment. Then he said the words that officially began everything that followed. "You are dismissed. May you find peace before the end." We stood and walked out of that chamber together, Grace and I, and the doors closed behind us with a heavy metallic sound. The moment we were alone in the corridor, out of sight of any alien cameras, Grace let out a breath and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. "Ethan," she said, "get command on a secure line. Tell them the Council just declared war on us, like we are supposed to be scared of the word." "Are we?" I asked, because I genuinely did not know the answer. She looked at me, and for the first time that day, I saw something other than calm in her expression. It was not fear. It was something closer to tired amusement, the look of someone who has heard the same threat too many times to count. "Ethan, how many wars has Earth fought against itself in the last 200 years? "A lot," I said. "How many of those wars were fought with weapons far worse than anything the Council has ever built?" I did not answer, because I already knew where this was going. They think a war declaration is supposed to make us fold, she said, walking fast now, her boots clicking against the polished floor. They think 11 words from an old man in a fancy robe is supposed to be the end of the conversation. Ethan, we have been fighting each other and surviving each other since before we figured out how to write. This is not new to us. This is Tuesday. I laughed, and I immediately felt guilty for laughing, because somewhere out past the station's viewport, an alien fleet was probably already receiving orders to move toward our solar system. But I understood the joke, even as it scared me. We reached the communications bay, and I patched a channel through to Earth Defense Command. The signal took a few seconds to stabilize, the way it always did, across that much distance, and then a familiar voice crackled through. "Cole, is that you? What is the status up there?" It was Owen Marsh, a fleet commander I had spoken with a handful of times before, a steady voice that never seemed to rise no matter what was happening. I explained everything, as fast as I could, the declaration, the Council's confidence, Grace's response. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Then Owen laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a real one, low and short. "They actually said that? Declared war like it was a court summons?" "Word for word," I said. "All right," Owen said, and I could hear him already moving, already giving orders to someone else in the background. "Tell the ambassador we appreciate the warning. Tell her command is putting the fleet on alert, and tell her we will have a formal reply drafted within the hour." "What kind of reply?" I asked. Owen's voice went quiet for a second, thoughtful. "The kind that tells them we heard them," he said, "and that we are not impressed." I ended the call and looked at Grace, who was watching the stars through the viewport, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable now. "You really think we can survive this?" I asked her. She did not answer right away. She kept looking out at the darkness, at the pinpricks of light that represented star systems most humans would never visit in their lifetimes. "Ethan," she finally said, "I do not think we can survive this. I know we can. The Council has spent centuries fighting soft species. Species that surrender when they see the size of a fleet. Species that never had to fight for every single inch of their own planet the way we did." She turned to face me. "We are not those species, and they are about to find that out the hard way." I wanted to believe her completely, but a small part of me, the part that had grown up watching footage of the Council's war fleets destroying entire rebel colonies in a single day, was still afraid. I kept that fear to myself, because I did not think it would help anyone to hear it out loud. That night, alone in my quarters on the station, I opened a private channel and recorded a short message to send back to my family on Earth. I told them I loved them. I told them not to worry. I told them that whatever happened, I was proud to be human on the day the galaxy decided we were worth being afraid of. I did not know yet how right that message would turn out to be. Outside my window, the stars looked the same as they always had, calm and distant, and unaware that somewhere among them, a war had just begun that would change how every species in the galaxy understood the word human. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily that night. Instead, I kept replaying Grace's question in my mind, over and over, the way you replay a song that will not leave your head. "Is that all?" 3 simple words. And somehow, in that room full of ancient, powerful beings who had never lost a war in living memory, those 3 words had sounded less like defiance and more like a promise. A promise that the Council had made a mistake it did not yet understand. I did not sleep much that night, and by morning I had made a decision. If this was really going to happen, if the galaxy was really going to test humanity the way Threll seemed to believe, then I wanted to see it for myself. Not from behind a desk, not from second-hand reports filtered through diplomatic channels, but up close, where the truth actually lived. I requested a transfer to the Forward Observation Corps the next day. Grace signed the papers without asking a single question, though she did give me a long look before she handed the pad back to me. "You sure about this, Ethan?" she asked. No, I admitted, but I think I need to see what we actually are before I spend the rest of my life explaining it to people who were not there. She nodded slowly, like she understood exactly what I meant, because in some way she was doing the same thing every single day in that chamber full of aliens who still did not understand what they had just started. 2 days later, I received new orders. I was being reassigned to a fleet gathering near the edge of human territory, a fleet that Owen Marsh himself would be commanding. My transport ship would leave within the week. I packed my bags that night with hands that would not stop shaking, not from fear exactly, but from something closer to anticipation. Somewhere out there, alien commanders were preparing their forces, confident in their ancient records, confident in their unbroken history of victory. They had no idea what they were about to walk into, and honestly, neither did I. Not yet. But I was about to find out, and so was the rest of the galaxy. The transport ship that carried me to the gathering fleet was called the Endeavor, and it smelled like recycled air and strong coffee, which somehow made it feel more like home than the polished, sterile station I had just left behind. I spent most of the journey reading old reports, trying to understand why the Council was so confident and why humanity was not. What I found surprised me more than I expected. The Council measured strength the way an accountant measures wealth. They counted ships, they counted guns, they counted the size of a fleet and the range of its weapons, and from those numbers alone, they decided who would win a war before a single shot was fired. By that measurement, humanity looked small. Our fleet was young. Our weapons, compared to some of the older species in the Council, looked almost primitive, built from metal and fire and simple physics instead of the exotic energy systems some species had mastered centuries ago. But numbers on a page do not tell the whole story, and I began to understand that on the 3rd day of my journey, when I met a woman named Nadia Voss. Nadia was a colony defense officer, transferred to the fleet from a border world called Ashgrove, a small settlement that had faced 3 separate raids from pirate bands in the last 2 years. She was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that comes from someone who has seen more than they talk about. But once she started speaking about her home, she did not stop. "People think Earth is soft because we talk about peace so much," she told me one evening in the mess hall, stirring a cup of something that was supposed to be tea but tasted more like hot water with regret. "They do not understand that every single colony we have built, we built while defending it from something. Storms, disease, each other, sometimes. Pirates, more often than anyone likes to admit. We do not get handed safety. We build it, piece by piece, and we fight to keep it." I asked her what she meant, and she told me a story that stuck with me for a long time. 2 years earlier, a raiding group had attacked Ashgrove with weapons more advanced than anything the colony possessed. The colony had no fleet to speak of, only a handful of old defense satellites and a civilian population that had never expected to fight a war. By the numbers, the raiders should have won in minutes. Instead, the colonists dug in. They used the terrain, the tunnels beneath their settlement, built originally for storing grain, and turned them into shelters and ambush points. They used old mining equipment as makeshift barriers. They coordinated using low-frequency radios that the raiders' scanners could not easily detect, because nobody had expected a civilian population to build a communication network from spare parts in under a week. The raid that was supposed to take a single day turned into a standoff that lasted 11 days, and by the end of it, the raiders had lost more than half their forces and retreated without ever taking the colony. "We did not win because we had better weapons," Nadia said. "We won because we refused to stop finding new ways to survive. That is the thing the Council does not understand about us. We do not fight fair. We fight to win." I thought about that story for the rest of the journey, and I started noticing other stories, like it scattered throughout the reports I was reading. A trade convoy that fought off a pirate ambush using cargo containers rigged with old mining explosives. A research outpost that survived an unexpected attack by flooding its own corridors with freezing gas. turning its own environment into a weapon against invaders who were not built to survive extreme cold. A single scout ship that outmaneuvered 3 enemy vessels, not through superior speed, but through a pilot who understood how to use asteroid fields as cover in ways no alien navigation computer had been programmed to predict. None of these stories were secret. They were all recorded, all documented, all available for any council analyst who wanted to read them. But the council never seemed to read them the right way. They saw small numbers and assumed weakness. They never stopped to ask why those small numbers kept surviving encounters that should have destroyed them completely. I brought this up with Owen Marsh once I finally reached the fleet, standing in the observation deck of his flagship, watching the stars slide past the reinforced viewport. "They think we are predictable," Owen said, not looking away from the stars. "They study our old wars, our history, and they think that tells them everything about how we fight now. But history does not repeat exactly, Ethan. It rhymes, and humans have always been good at learning from the last mistake, so we do not make it twice." "So what happens when their fleet actually arrives?" I asked. Owen finally turned to look at me, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite excitement and not quite fear, but a strange mixture of both, the look of a man who has trained his entire life for a moment he hoped would never actually come. "They will come in expecting a straight fight," he said. "Line up their ships, line up ours, and let the bigger fleet win, the way it always has for them before. That is how they have fought every war they have ever won. Overwhelming force against an enemy who plays by the same rules they do." "And we are not going to play by those rules," I said, understanding now. "We never have," Owen said. "Not once in our entire history. Every war humanity ever won, we won because we found the fight our enemy was not prepared for. We are not going to meet their fleet head-on and hope for the best. We are going to make them fight a war they have never had to fight before." Over the next several days, I watched that plan take shape from the inside, and it was unlike anything I expected. Instead of a single massive fleet formation, Owen's forces scattered across dozens of positions, some near populated systems, some in empty space that seemed to serve no purpose at all until I realized they were positioned along old asteroid belts and gravity wells that no council navigation system would think to check first. Instead of relying only on the newest warships, older vessels were refitted with jury-rigged modifications, weapons systems adjusted in ways that defense engineers back on Earth had spent years perfecting through simulated combat against theoretical enemies. Decoy signals were built to mimic entire fleet formations that did not actually exist, designed to confuse enemy sensors and stretch their attention across a dozen false targets. Civilian engineers who had spent their careers building mining equipment were brought in to consult on weapon modifications, because as it turned out, the tools used to break apart solid asteroids for resources were not so different from weapons that could break apart armored hulls, if you knew how to aim them. I met a woman named Priya Sharma during this time, an engineer who had spent 15 years working on asteroid mining rigs before being recruited into the fleet's technical division. She showed me one of the modified mining lasers now mounted on a support vessel, and she grinned like a proud parent showing off a child's achievement. "The Council builds weapons to fight other Council fleets," she told me. "Big, slow, powerful things meant to punch through heavy armor in a straight-line battle. This was built to cut through solid rock at odd angles, in zero visibility, guided by instinct and math instead of expensive targeting computers. It is not elegant, but it works, and it is cheap enough that we can build 100 of them for the price of one of their fancy cannons." I asked her if she was scared, and she laughed, a short, surprised sound, like the question had not occurred to her. "Of course I am scared," she said, "but I built things to survive Ashgrove's asteroid fields for a decade before any of this started. I am not going to stop being useful just because the reason changed. The more time I spent among these people, engineers and soldiers and pilots and colony defenders pulled from every corner of human space, the more I understood what Grace had meant back on the station. This was not bravado. This was not empty confidence dressed up as courage. This was preparation, decades of it, built quietly by a species that had never once been given an easy path to survival, and had learned, generation after generation, exactly how to make the most of every disadvantage thrown at it. The Council thought they were facing a young, weak species that had simply never encountered a real threat before. They were about to learn that humanity had never encountered anything but real threats, for its entire existence, and had survived every single one of them. 3 days before the Council fleet was expected to arrive at the border, I stood with Owen Marsh on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final preparations unfold across a dozen different screens. Ships moved into position. Communication drills ran one final time. Somewhere in the depths of the ship, soldiers checked their equipment for what felt like the 100th time that week, not because they doubted their tools, but because checking things carefully was simply what humans did when the stakes were high. "Are you ready for this?" Owen asked me, without turning from the screens. I thought about the question honestly before I answered it. "I do not know if ready is the right word," I said, "but I trust the people around me. I think that might be enough." Owen nodded slowly, like that was exactly the answer he wanted to hear. "That," he said, "is exactly how every human victory in history has started." Outside the viewport, the stars continued their slow, silent movement, indifferent to the war that was about to begin. Somewhere beyond them, an alien fleet was closing the distance, confident, proud, and utterly unprepared for what they were about to find waiting for them. I did not know exactly what the coming days would bring, but for the first time since Threll had spoken those words back in the Grand Assembly Hall, I found that my fear had quietly turned into something else entirely. Something that felt, strangely, a lot like hope. The alarm sounded at exactly 4 in the morning ship time, and I was awake before the second tone finished echoing through the corridor. The Council fleet had arrived. I made my way to the observation deck as fast as I could, my heart pounding harder than it ever had in my life, and when I reached the viewport, I understood immediately why every officer around me had gone completely silent. Space outside the ship was filled with lights. Hundreds of them, arranged in a formation so precise it looked almost artistic, like someone had taken a ruler to the stars themselves. Council warships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, stretched across the darkness in perfect rows, their hulls gleaming faintly under the light of a distant sun. Owen Marsh stood at the center of the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the same sight without a hint of panic in his expression. "Report," he said calmly. "Fleet count confirmed at approximately 300 vessels," an officer replied, her voice steady despite the number she had just spoken. "Formation matches historical Council battle doctrine. They are moving toward the colony world Meridian Rest, sir. ETA 6 hours." Meridian Rest was a small human colony, barely 12,000 people, mostly farmers and researchers, who had settled there less than a decade earlier. It had almost no military presence of its own, which made it, from the Council's perspective, the perfect target for a quick and humiliating example. They had chosen wrong, though they did not know it yet. "All units, hold position," Owen ordered. "Let them come to us. Do not engage until my signal." I watched the fleet formations on the main screen, human ships scattered across dozens of positions that had seemed strange to me only days earlier, hidden among asteroid fields, tucked behind gas giants, positioned in orbits that made no obvious tactical sense to anyone reading a standard sensor display. But I understood now. This was not a wall meant to block the enemy fleet. This was a trap shaped like an entire star system. The Council fleet moved closer to Meridian Rest with the same slow, confident precision they had shown in the Grand Assembly Hall. Their sensors swept the system, searching for the large, obvious fleet formation their doctrine expected to find. Instead, they found scattered debris fields that looked like nothing more than natural asteroid clusters, and a handful of small support vessels near the colony that looked, on the surface, like an easy first target. I later learned that the Council commander leading that fleet was named General Korth, a decorated officer with victories against 4 separate rebellions to his name. According to intercepted communications we managed to translate afterward, his opening message to his own fleet was simple and confident. Proceed to orbital position. Begin planetary pacification sequence. Expect minimal resistance. Minimal resistance. I thought about those words for a long time afterward, because they captured perfectly everything the Council did not understand about the people they were about to fight. The Council fleet entered orbit around Meridian Rest, their weapons systems powering up, ready to demonstrate exactly why no species had ever successfully defied a Council war declaration. And that was the exact moment Owen Marsh gave the signal. What happened next unfolded so fast that I struggled to follow it even while watching it happen in real time on the bridge screens. The asteroid fields that Council sensors had dismissed as natural debris were not natural at all. Hidden inside them were dozens of modified mining vessels, the same kind Priya Sharma had shown me days earlier, their weapons designed to cut through solid rock, now aimed instead at the flanks of the Council fleet. They opened fire from angles the Council ships were not braced for, striking weak points in their armor that standard battle doctrine never considered, because no Council fleet had ever fought an enemy willing to hide weapons inside what looked like empty space. At the same time, decoy signals that had been broadcasting false fleet positions for the last several hours suddenly went silent, and real human warships emerged from behind Meridian Rest's largest moon, catching the Council fleet in a formation they had never trained to counter, attacked from multiple directions at once instead of a single predictable front line. On the colony's surface, the defenders Nadia Voss had helped train activated a network of ground-based defense systems, old technology repurposed with new modifications, disrupting the Council's targeting systems just enough to slow their attack and buy the fleet above precious extra minutes. I heard General Korth's voice again in a later intercepted transmission, and this time it carried none of the calm confidence from before. Reform formation. Reform immediately. We are taking fire from unexpected vectors. I need updated sensor sweeps now. But by then, it was already too late for a clean reformation. Chaos had a way of feeding on itself, and the Council fleet, trained for generations to fight in straight, organized lines against enemies who followed the same rules, simply did not have an answer for a battle that refused to follow any predictable shape at all. Owen moved through the bridge giving orders in a calm, steady voice that never once wavered, even as reports came in of damage to our own ships, even as the numbers on the display screens shifted and changed faster than I could track them. Second wave. Target their supply vessels, he said. Do not waste time on their heaviest ships. They are built to survive frontal assaults. Cut off their ability to resupply and repair instead. I watched as human ships peeled away from the main engagement, ignoring the largest and most heavily armored Council vessels entirely, instead striking at smaller support ships that carried fuel, repair drones, and communication relays. It was not the kind of attack the Council fleet had prepared for. Their doctrine assumed an enemy would always aim for the biggest, most impressive targets first, the way armies always had in their own history. Humanity aimed for the parts of the fleet that could not defend themselves, the parts that made everything else function, and within an hour, the Council fleet's ability to coordinate and resupply had been cut apart almost as thoroughly as their formation. I will not pretend it was easy, or that we did not suffer losses of our own. 3 human vessels were destroyed during that battle, and I later learned the names of every single person who served on them, because Owen made sure every name was read aloud during a memorial ceremony held once the fighting ended. War was never going to be free of cost, no matter how well prepared we were, and nobody on that bridge treated the victory that day as anything other than serious and heavy, even in the middle of the celebration that followed. But the Council fleet, the one that had arrived expecting minimal resistance, retreated from Meridian Rest roughly 5 hours after the battle began, having lost nearly a third of their ships and having failed completely to take control of a colony defended by a fraction of their numbers. I stood on the bridge as the last Council vessels jumped away, retreating faster than their formation should have technically allowed, and I felt something shift in the room around me. Not celebration exactly, not yet, but a kind of quiet, settled understanding among everyone present. We had done it, not through overwhelming force, not through matching the council ship for ship, or gun for gun, but through exactly the kind of thinking Owen had described days earlier. We had made them fight a war they had never trained for, and it had cost them everything their old strategies depended on. Later that day, I was given access to a partial transcript of General Korth's report back to Council Command, translated by our linguistics team from an intercepted communication burst. I do not know if the translation was perfectly accurate, but the tone came through clearly enough. The human forces did not fight according to any recognized doctrine, the report read. They used civilian technology repurposed for combat. They employed deception at a scale our sensors were not designed to detect. Recommend immediate reassessment of human military capability before further engagement is authorized. I read that report 3 times before I fully understood what it meant. The Council, an organization that had never lost a war in living memory, an organization confident enough to declare war on us with 11 casual words in a chamber full of witnesses, had just been forced to admit they did not understand who they were fighting. Nadia found me later that evening in the mess hall, staring at a cup of coffee I had not touched in over an hour. "You look like someone who just watched history happen," she said, sitting down across from me. "I think I did," I admitted. She smiled, tired, but genuine, the kind of smile that comes after a long, hard day where things somehow still turned out right. "This is only the beginning, Ethan," she said. "They are going to come back, probably with a bigger fleet, probably with better preparation, but now they know something they did not know before." "What is that?" I asked. "That we are not going to make this easy for them," she said. "And once a species like the Council realizes an enemy is not predictable, they start to panic. Predictability is the only thing that made their old strategy work for as long as it did." I thought about General Korth's report again, about the careful, formal language trying to describe a battle that had gone completely against everything his fleet had been trained to expect. I thought about Threll standing in that grand chamber, so certain that 11 words would be enough to end a war before it truly began. And I thought about Grace Whitfield's question, the one that had started everything. Is that all? I finally understood, sitting there in that mess hall surrounded by tired, quietly proud soldiers and engineers, that the Council had never actually answered that question. They had simply assumed the answer was yes, that their fleet, their history, their reputation would be enough to end this before it began. They had been wrong, and the battle at Meridian Rest was only the first proof of exactly how wrong they truly were. Outside the ship, repair crews worked through the night fixing damaged hull sections, and somewhere across human space, news of the victory was already spreading, colony to colony, ship to ship, carried by people who had spent their entire lives being told by the wider galaxy that humanity did not matter enough to be feared. That belief, I suspected, was about to change very quickly. News of Meridian Rest spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected, and the ripples it caused reached far beyond human space. I did not understand the full scale of what had happened until Grace Whitfield called me back to the station a week after the battle, asking me to sit in on a series of meetings that she said I needed to witness for myself. I boarded a transport still carrying the tired ache of the fleet in my bones, and when I arrived, the atmosphere on the station felt completely different from the tense, uncertain place I had left behind. The corridors were busier than before, filled with delegates from species I did not recognize, all of them requesting private audiences with human representatives. Grace met me at the docking bay herself, which surprised me, given how much her schedule must have filled up since the battle. "You picked an interesting week to come back," she said, walking briskly toward the diplomatic wing. "What is happening?" I asked, struggling to keep up with her pace. "The Council is not as united as they like to appear," she said. "Meridian Rest cracked something open, and now everyone wants to see how deep the crack goes." She led me into a small private meeting room, where a delegation from a species called the Virel was already waiting. I had read about the Virel before, a species who had been council members for centuries, quiet and cooperative, never causing trouble, never standing out. I had never expected to see one of their representatives requesting a private meeting with humans. Their lead delegate introduced herself as Sael, a slender being with pale, papery skin and deep green eyes that studied me carefully before she spoke. "We watched the battle recordings from Meridian Rest," Sael said, her voice measured and careful. "We have never seen the Council fleet retreat from an engagement in over 200 years of recorded history." "Neither had we before last week," Grace replied. Sael folded her hands together, choosing her next words slowly, like each one carried weight she did not want to waste. "The Virel joined the Council 3 centuries ago. After our own homeworld was threatened by outside forces the Council promised to protect us from," she said. "We have honored every rule since then. We disarmed our fleets as required. We accepted their trade regulations, their territorial decisions, their judgments in every dispute we brought before them. We believed cooperation was the only path to safety." "And now?" Grace asked. Sael's green eyes flicked briefly toward me before returning to Grace. "Now we watch a species that refused to disarm, and we see that refusal rewarded with survival, while our own compliance has left us with nothing to defend ourselves if the Council ever turns its attention toward us instead," she said. "We are not here to declare loyalty to humanity, Ambassador. We are here to ask what humanity intends to do with the position it has just earned." I watched Grace consider the question carefully before answering, and I understood in that moment just how much responsibility had settled onto her shoulders since that day in the Grand Assembly Hall. "We are not interested in replacing the Council with something worse," Grace said finally. "We fought because we were told to disarm or be destroyed, and we chose to survive instead. We are not building an empire, Counselor Sael. We are defending our right to exist on our own terms." Sael studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something in her posture relaxing just slightly. "That is the answer I hope to hear," she said. "The Virel will not openly defy the Council. Not yet, but we will no longer act against our own interests, simply because the Council demands it. Consider this meeting a quiet first step." After Sael left, Grace turned to me with a tired but satisfied expression. "That is the 4th species this week to request a private meeting like that one," she said. "The Council built their authority on the belief that resistance was pointless, that defiance always ended in destruction. Meridian Rest proved that belief wrong in front of the entire galaxy, and now every species who ever felt trapped by Council rule is quietly wondering what else might be possible." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind as I walked the station's corridors that evening. It was strange, watching centuries of assumed authority begin to wobble because of a single battle, a battle that had felt, from inside it, less like the beginning of a revolution and more like a group of frightened, determined people simply trying to protect their homes. But not every reaction to Meridian Rest was hopeful or cautious. Some species reacted with something closer to desperation, and I witnessed that firsthand 3 days later, when a delegation from a species called the Korath requested an emergency meeting. The Korath were smaller in number than most Council species, their homeworld located near a dangerous stretch of contested space that had seen repeated raids from hostile forces for generations. Their delegate, a broad, heavily built being named Drouse, did not bother with the careful diplomatic language Sael had used. "We need weapons," Drouse said bluntly, the moment the meeting began. "Not promises, not sympathy, weapons, and training to use them, before the raiders currently circling our border decide we are an easy target while the Council is distracted fighting you." Grace's expression grew serious. "We are not in a position to arm every species who asks us for help, Delegate Drouse. We are fighting for our own survival right now." "Then let us fight alongside you," Drouse said. "Give us the knowledge you used at Meridian Rest. Show us how a small, determined force can stand against overwhelming numbers. We are not asking for charity, Ambassador. We are asking for a chance. I watched Grace weigh the request carefully, and I understood the difficult position she was in. Every alliance offered opportunity, but also risk, and every decision made in that small meeting room could shift the balance of an entire war still unfolding across dozens of star systems. I cannot promise weapons today, Grace said finally, but I can promise this conversation will not be forgotten, and that humanity does not intend to stand alone in a fight for the right to defend ourselves. Give me time, Delegate Drouse, and I will bring your request to our full council for consideration. Drouse did not look entirely satisfied, but he nodded, accepting the answer for what it was worth. That night, I sat with Grace in her private office, the two of us reviewing the day's events long after the station's public corridors had gone quiet. "Do you ever worry we are taking on more than we can handle?" I asked her. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes with tired hands. "Every single day," she admitted. "But Ethan, I think about what would have happened if we had simply surrendered when Threll made his declaration. If we had disarmed, like the Varel did centuries ago, hoping the Council would protect us in return. I think about the raiders threatening the Korath, and how easily that could have been us instead, if we had ever given up the ability to defend ourselves." She looked at me directly, her expression steady despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "We did not ask for this war," she said, "but now that it has started, I think we have a responsibility to make sure it changes something, not just for us, but for every species tired of living under the assumption that resistance is always pointless." 2 days later, humanity's official reply to the Council arrived, drafted jointly by Military Command and the Diplomatic Corps, and Grace asked me to deliver it personally to the Council chamber, since I had been present for the original declaration months earlier. I stood in that same grand hall, the same circular table, the same 6 Council delegates seated in their formal positions, though Threll's expression had changed considerably since our last meeting. Gone was the calm, confident superiority from before. In its place was something more careful, more measured, the expression of someone recalculating decisions they had once considered simple and obvious. I read the message aloud exactly as it had been written, my voice steady despite the weight of everyone's attention in that room. "To the Galactic Council, we did not seek this conflict, but we will not surrender the right to defend ourselves for the comfort of those who demand our submission. Humanity does not intend to conquer, nor to rule beyond our own territory. We intend only to prove, clearly and completely, that no species should ever again be forced to disarm itself for the sake of another's convenience. Consider this both an answer and a warning. We finish what we are forced to start." The silence that followed lasted longer than I expected. Threll finally spoke, his voice quieter than the confident tone he had used months earlier. "You understand this message will only encourage further resistance among other member species," he said. "We understand it perfectly," I replied, echoing words I had heard Grace use so many times by now that they felt natural in my own mouth. "That understanding does not change our answer." I left the chamber that day, carrying something heavier than the datapad in my hands. I carried the weight of an entire galaxy slowly beginning to question a system it had accepted as unshakable for centuries, and I understood, walking back through those long, quiet corridors, that whatever happened next would not simply decide the fate of humanity. It would decide the shape of the galaxy itself, for generations to come. The final battle did not happen where anyone expected it to happen, and it did not happen the way the Council wanted it to happen either. After Meridian rest, the Council spent nearly 2 months regrouping, gathering a larger fleet than before, one built specifically to counter the tactics that had embarrassed General Korth's forces so completely. I learned later that Korth had been removed from command entirely, replaced by a younger officer named Vantis, someone the Council believed would approach the war with fresh thinking instead of outdated doctrine. Vantis, to her credit, had actually studied the recordings from Meridian Rest carefully. Her new fleet formation was more flexible, spread across a wider area, less predictable than the tight, orderly lines Korth had used. She had clearly learned something from her predecessor's defeat, and for a while, that worried me more than the size of her fleet ever could. But there was one thing Vantis had not accounted for, one thing that no amount of studying recordings could have prepared her for. She was still operating under the assumption that humanity was fighting to win a single decisive battle, the way the Council always had, one grand engagement to decide the outcome of an entire war. Humanity was not fighting that kind of war at all. By the time Vantis's fleet arrived at what she believed was our primary staging ground, a mid-sized colony called New Halden, she found the system almost entirely empty. Our fleet had already moved, weeks earlier, redistributed across a dozen smaller positions throughout human territory, each one prepared to defend itself independently, rather than depending on a single, centralized force that could be targeted and destroyed in one overwhelming strike. Instead of one large battle, Vantis's forces found themselves facing something much harder to counter, dozens of smaller engagements happening simultaneously across human space, each one testing a different weakness in their approach, each one costing them ships and resources without ever giving them the single decisive victory their doctrine told them they needed. I was present for one of these engagements myself, stationed aboard a defense platform near a colony called Pharaoh's Landing, watching alongside Nadia Voss as a smaller council detachment attempted to force their way past our defenses. It was strange, watching a battle unfold with none of the desperate uncertainty of Meridian rest. This time, we knew exactly what we were doing, and it showed in every calm, coordinated movement our forces made. "They still do not understand," Nadia said quietly, watching the council ships retreat after less than 2 hours of fighting. "They keep looking for the fight that will end this quickly. We are never going to give them that fight." She was right. Over the following weeks, reports came in from across human territory describing similar patterns. Council forces achieving small, costly victories in some places, suffering embarrassing defeats in others, but never once managing to land the single, crushing blow their entire strategy depended on. Meanwhile, humanity's alliances continued to grow quietly in the background, the Varel providing intelligence on Council fleet movements, the Korath receiving defensive training in exchange for information about the raiders threatening their border, other species watching carefully from the shadows, waiting to see how far this crack in Council authority would spread before deciding where their own loyalties belonged. 4 months after the war began, the Council requested a formal ceasefire meeting, and Grace Whitfield asked me to accompany her one final time, back to the same Grand Assembly Hall where everything had started. The chamber looked exactly the same as I remembered it, the same circular table, the same tall windows looking out into open space, but the atmosphere inside it had changed completely. Threll was still present, though he no longer sat at the head of the delegation the way he had months earlier. A new figure occupied that position instead, an older, weathered-looking being introduced to us as High Envoy Cassian, someone who had apparently been called out of retirement specifically to handle negotiations that the Council's usual leadership had proven incapable of managing. Cassian did not waste time with the kind of theatrical grandeur Threll had used at the start of this conflict. "Ambassador Whitfield," Cassian said, his voice carrying a weariness that felt genuine rather than performed. "The Council acknowledges that our original assessment of humanity's military capability was significantly flawed. We are prepared to discuss terms for ending this conflict." Grace remained standing rather than taking a seat, and I understood immediately that she wanted this moment to happen on her terms, not the Council's. "We are listening," she said simply. Cassian glanced briefly at the other delegates before continuing. "The Council proposes a full ceasefire, effective immediately, along with formal recognition of humanity's right to maintain independent defense forces without restriction. In exchange, we ask that humanity cease providing military support to other member species seeking independence from Council authority." I watched Grace consider the offer carefully, though I already suspected what her answer would be, having spent the last several months watching her navigate exactly this kind of decision. "We appreciate the offer," Grace said, "but I am afraid we cannot accept those terms as written." Cassian's expression tightened slightly. "May I ask why, Ambassador? This resolves the conflict entirely in humanity's favor." "It resolves the conflict in humanity's favor," Grace agreed. "But it does nothing for every other species still living under the same threats we refuse to accept. We did not fight this war simply to secure our own safety while abandoning everyone who reached out to us for help along the way." The chamber fell into a tense, uncertain silence. I watched several of the other delegates exchange glances, clearly unprepared for humanity to refuse a deal that so heavily favored our own interests. "What exactly are you proposing instead?" Cassian asked finally. Grace stepped forward, and I recognized the same calm, unshakable confidence she had shown in this exact room months earlier, when she had first asked Threll if that was truly all he had to say. "We propose a full revision of the Unification Accords," she said. "No member species will be required to disarm as a condition of Council membership. Any species wishing to leave the Council peacefully will be permitted to do so without penalty or retaliation. And any dispute between member species will be settled through negotiation rather than unilateral Council enforcement. You are asking us to dismantle the very foundation of Council authority," Cassian said, though his tone carried more exhaustion than outrage. "I am asking you to build a foundation that does not depend on fear to hold itself together," Grace replied. "The Council has ruled this galaxy for centuries by convincing every member species that resistance was pointless, that safety only existed within strict, unquestioning obedience. Humanity proved that assumption wrong, and I do not believe we are the only species who noticed." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the last traces of formal authority it once carried. "If we refuse these terms," he said, "you will simply continue supporting rebellion across the Council, one species at a time, until our authority collapses entirely regardless of what we decide here today." "That is one possibility," Grace admitted, "but I would rather you choose reform because it is right than have it forced upon you because you had no other choice left." Another long silence followed, and I found myself holding my breath, watching centuries of established power quietly weighing whether to bend or continue resisting a truth that had already been proven on more battlefields than anyone in that chamber could comfortably ignore. Finally, Cassian nodded, slow and deliberate. "The Council will bring your proposal before the full assembly for formal ratification," he said. "I cannot promise unanimous agreement, Ambassador, but I believe, after everything this conflict has shown us, that resistance to change would only invite the same outcome we have already witnessed at Meridian Rest, and at every engagement since." Grace extended her hand, a simple human gesture that Cassian studied for a moment before accepting it, an unfamiliar motion for him, but one he completed with careful respect. "Then I believe we have reached an understanding," Grace said. As the meeting drew to a close and delegates began filing out of the chamber, Threll approached us quietly, his expression a mixture of humility and something that looked almost like genuine curiosity. "Ambassador," he said, "may I ask you something, honestly, before we part ways today?" "Of course," Grace replied. "When I first declared war against your people," Threll said, "you asked me a question. Is that all? I dismissed it as arrogance at the time. But now, having seen everything that followed, I find myself wondering what you truly meant by those words." Grace considered the question carefully before answering, and I found myself leaning in slightly, curious to hear the answer myself, even after everything I had witnessed over the past several months. "I meant exactly what I said," Grace told him. "You offered us a threat you believed was absolute, the worst thing you could possibly do to us. And I asked if that was all, because humanity has faced worse threats than a Council war declaration throughout our entire history, and we are still here. I was not being arrogant, Envoy Threll. I was simply telling you the truth. Your declaration was not the ending you believed it to be. For us, it was simply another beginning." Threll nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression that looked, for the first time since I had met him, like genuine respect. "I understand now," he said quietly. "I believe the entire council understands now." We left the chamber together, Grace and I, walking the same corridors we had walked on the very first day this entire conflict began. The station felt different around us now, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a kind of cautious, uncertain peace, finally settling over a galaxy that had spent centuries assuming things could never truly change. I thought about everything that had happened since that first meeting, the battle at Meridian Rest, the quiet alliances formed in private meeting rooms, the long months of scattered engagements that never gave the Council the single decisive victory they so desperately needed. I thought about Nadia, and Priya, and Owen, and every single person who had proven, piece by piece, that humanity's strength was never about matching an enemy ship for ship or weapon for weapon. It was about refusing to accept an ending simply because someone more powerful declared it was inevitable. Grace stopped walking for a moment, looking out through one of the station's long viewports at the stars spread endlessly beyond the glass, the same stars that had once seemed so indifferent to everything happening beneath them. "Do you think this is really over?" I asked her. She smiled, tired but genuinely at peace, in a way I had not seen from her since long before this entire conflict began. "I think this particular chapter is over," she said. "But Ethan, I do not think humanity is ever truly finished. I think we are only getting started." I looked out at those same stars, remembering the fear I had felt standing in that chamber months earlier, listening to Threll declare a war meant to end us before we ever had the chance to prove what we were capable of. The galaxy had learned something important during those months, something I suspected would echo through every corner of council space for generations to come. They had learned that humanity did not measure strength the way they did. They had learned that small numbers, clever thinking, and stubborn determination could accomplish things no fleet count or weapon calibration could ever fully predict. And somewhere, in quiet conversations happening across dozens of newly hopeful species throughout the galaxy, I suspected people were already repeating the same three words that had started this entire remarkable, unlikely story. Is that all? Because for humanity, it never had been, and it never would be again.